All right, well, welcome to week 3 of our Basics of the BCP class. Good to have everybody here. And we might be doing a little bit shorter of a class today, just depending on what sort of questions and comments from last week we got. I wanted to give, allow a good amount of time this week just for folks that have been working through morning prayer, doing their homework from last week, to have questions, feedback, anything like that. So yeah, without further ado, let's just open it up for that to begin with. So especially if you've really only looked at it in deep within the last week, if you have anything, any questions, any feedback, any thoughts on morning prayer.
I unmuted. This is Randy. I enjoyed going through it. I'm going to try and make it a practice. I did have one question about the readings in front. You know, like I think last week was the 9th Sunday after Trinity, and
Right.
this Sunday be 10th. You know, they have the readings, Psalms, first and second lesson, Monday through Saturday, are you know, straightforward, but on top they've got like three readings, the Psalms, first lesson and second lesson, and I was wondering why is it set up that way?
That's an excellent question. Very good question. So we're talking about the lectionary, daily office lectionary up front. Let's look at page Roman numeral 30, because that's the week we're in now. Yeah. Roman numeral 30 for the 9th Sunday after Trinity. So as Randy pointed out, things are pretty sequential Monday through Saturday, but what about at the top? So that's our Sunday readings for morning and evening prayer. And I think having that many options was pretty new for the 1928, if memory serves. And basically it's giving the parishes who are going to have multiple services, or who just are kind of wanting a little variety for their Sunday readings and preaching, to have options. So basically you would generally want to choose, the readings are on the same line. So it's not pick one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, but you would choose either Psalm 115 with Ezekiel 14 and 1 Thessalonians 4, or Psalm 103 with Wisdom 11 and John 8, or Psalm 91 with Genesis 28 and 2 Corinthians 9. That's kind of the idea behind it. And the Old Testament reading for Sunday morning with the star is the one that relates to our Holy Communion readings, the Epistle and the Gospel from Communion. So that's really what those are. And again, this comes from a period of time when morning prayer and evening prayer as the principal Sunday services was a lot more common than it is now. Nowadays, almost no parishes in North America anyway are doing for their principal service morning prayer. And it just comes from a period of time when communion wasn't quite as often. So that's why there's more variety for the morning and evening prayer for Sunday.
Yeah, I understand. You can kind of pick out which one you want, but stay with the same row.
Yeah, yes, for your private readings, that's probably the best way to go. And I usually default to whichever one has the starred Old Testament or Apocrypha lesson, because I know we're going to be doing Holy Communion, and so the readings that line up best with communion I find best for me. But I mean, that's just the way I do it. And the other thing that's important to note, just kind of conceptualizing the way this was all intended to be, is that the rubrics at the very beginning in the concerning the lessons and readings and that sort of thing, that essay that's at the beginning of morning and evening prayer, it basically gives the minister some flexibility to substitute for the reading of whichever day they're doing it, one of the readings from throughout that week. So let's say I was only going to be offering one midweek public service. It might not be a bad idea, to grab one of the Sunday readings rather than the weekday assigned one, because it's kind of thematic with what you've been doing on Sunday. Alternatively, you might choose to do the one that's assigned for the day, because based on the assumption that everybody's doing it at home. In my experience, that's not a great assumption to make, but it's a good idea. So yeah, there's some flexibility there. Anybody else have anything from their going through morning prayer over the last week or so, or if something's been you've been doing it in the past, kind of been hanging up on you? Pam, go ahead.
I didn't really have a question. I kind of went back to where we were doing matins on Friday mornings, and I think there's a real treasure in the chanting of the morning prayers. And I was curious as if there is any time that we would learn those chantings.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about that. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. I think this fall I would like to do a workshop on chanting, just plain chant in general, but specifically within the context of morning and evening prayer for our prayer book. Yeah, details to follow, but probably what we're looking at is a couple of long Saturday mornings or something like that, rather than kind of as the main class. But yeah, I think that'd be a good thing to do, give a little bit of primer. And once I decide when we're going to do it, I'll give a good month and a half notice so that folks can order a copy of the St. Dunstan's Psalter, because that is what we would be using for that. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Randy had said that he looks forward to kind of incorporating that into his devotions. Building up the habit of using the offices, it can take some time to really get that habit ingrained. And to be honest, I'm not fully there yet. Where it's, I remember Gerald Bray. He's a Anglican priest who. One of the leading evangelical scholars. He used to be at Beeson Divinity School for a long time. I think he's retired, or he's moved on to a different institution. But I remember Gerald Bray giving a talk when he was saying that his first probably about 5 to 10 years as a priest, the only reason why he was doing it faithfully was because he was under supervision he was a curate under supervision of his rector, and his rector made him do it with him. He was like, this is your duty, you're going to come do this, and I'm going to kind of enforce it. He says, but now after decades of doing it, his day is totally incomplete if he misses swimming in the morning and morning and evening prayer. It's just part of the routine. So that's the goal. I'm not there yet. I wish I was there. It'd be a lot easier if I was. And we do have some tools that can help with that regularity. In particular, I find the website Cradle of Prayer, because they do an audio for the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. So it's cradleofprayer.org. And they do throw that audio onto a podcast, but they're not always at this point. The podcast doesn't always update, and it'll kind of update for 3 weeks and it'll go off for 4 or 5. So, but you can get that on your phone through your website too. So I find when I really, really, really am having troubles pulling out my prayer book and my Bible and doing it, pulling up that audio is a nice crutch to have. Or if I'm traveling or something like that, and I've got to be up at 3 in the morning, on the road or something like that. I find that very helpful. A lot of other folks at the parish have historically liked to use, it's commonprayer.org, who their website's very old school. It kind of looks like a Netscape Navigator sort of website from, the late 90s or early aughts. But they do have links for the entire service in text-based. So I know a lot of folks at the parish, rather than reading through it with their prayer book and trying to navigate it all, they just pull up that website and do it that way. Some folks, it's because they just prefer to do things through their device or their laptop. Other folks, it's because it takes a lot of the guesswork of the readings out. So those are a couple of resources. All right. If there's anything else on morning prayer, do jump in. I figure though, with the rest of our time today, and again, we might go a little bit short, I want to look at very briefly at evening prayer, and then family prayer, and possibly, depending on how time's looking, we might look at the litany. So evening prayer begins on page 21 in your prayer book. So if y'all would pull that out, open that up to page 21. And we're not going to go through this in detail like we did, or even the detail we did with morning prayer last week, because what you're going to find is that the format of evening prayer is almost exactly the same as morning prayer. The canticles are different, the opening sentences are different, and it doesn't have an opening canticle, an inviatory anthem, we call it. It doesn't have a correspondence to the Venite. Later prayer books, the 79 and the ACNA's 2019 do have an old Greek hymn, the Phos Hilarion, in that place, because that is kind of something that was rediscovered during the liturgical movement. So that kind of takes the place of the Venite for evening prayer for a lot of folks. But our evening prayer straight up doesn't have anything like that. Yeah, again, so the opening sentences on page 21 and 22 are slightly different, but it's the same kind of thing. You've got general ones and then opening sentences for the different holy days. We've got general confession. We got two different kinds of absolutions, a short one and a long one. Everything else goes the same. The area where I do want to take a look at things is the canticles, though. So just like with morning prayer, you do the psalm, then you do a reading, an Old Testament reading, then a canticle, New Testament reading, canticle. And just like in morning prayer, we have a few options. So let's look at page 26. I want to look at the first of, I want to look at our canticles just very briefly. So the default canticle that you'll find on page 26 is the Magnificat. So that's the Song of Mary from Luke chapter 1. And traditionally, this is the canticle for the first canticle in evening prayer. The Psalms, again, are in here really kind of as a concession to the Puritans' bias against the Magnificat, because it being Mary's song, they were like, gosh, this seems a little too Roman Catholic for us. So putting in Psalm, what is that? Psalm 98 and Psalm 92 are really concessions to the Puritans. I don't know anybody that does those instead of the Magnificat. It's just the way it's always been. And in the cathedral tradition, especially you'll see in the Church of England, you have a lot of people that compose music as settings for the Magnificat. There are just settings all over the place for the prayer book Magnificat, because choral evensong was historically a big deal in the Church of England. And it kind of is today too, especially in cathedrals and college towns, university towns. And they find that they get a lot of, the unchurched will come for choral evensong. And so some of it's kind of, the choir is going to be putting on a good show and they want to see the show. But this is a really good service for the unchurched. It's just straight up scripture, and especially when it's sung. And so a lot of, especially in kind of the university towns, the choral evensongs have become more and more popular recently, because the university students want something that is, kind of a break from all the technology, all the lights, all the screens, something that's just kind of quiet and contemplative. And so choral evensong really hits that button for a lot of them. So the Magnificat is, that's the default canticle for morning prayer. Turn the page and we'll see again, we have three options for the canticles for evening prayer. The Nunc Dimittis, which is the Song of Simeon, again, that's our default. and the Psalms were thrown in there really as concessions to the Puritan faction. You do find sometimes folks will use one of these Psalms instead of the Nunc Dimittis. Either they'll use the Psalm was the 68, so that Psalm on page 28 during Lent, because it's kind of penitential-ish. So some folks will use that during Lent instead. Other folks, if they're going to be using kind of a third-party compline service, will often, if they're going to also do morning prayer later, or I'm sorry, evening prayer, and then later on in the evening they'll do compline. They'll reserve the Nunc Dimittis for their compline, and they'll choose one of these psalms. There is let's turn back one page, back to 26. I thought this rubric was on 28, but it's on 26. There's a note here that says the third rubric at the top of page 26. But note that the minister at his discretion may omit one of the lessons in evening prayer, the lesson being read followed by one of the evening canticles. So if you're kind of in a time crunch, rubrically, it's cool to chop evening prayer down to one lesson and one canticle. We don't have that kind of rubric at morning prayer, but folks have kind of extrapolated as, well, if you can do it at one, you can do it at other. Rubric, technically with the rubrics, that's not the case, but I mean, that's whatever, it's your private devotions. And what ends up happening if you do that, if you kind of take the right options, you really do have a compline service. It's not called compline, but you really do have basically a compline service. So I think that's kind of interesting. And that's really all I have to say on evening prayer, because again, everything else is very similar. The format is exactly the same as morning prayer. The two collects that you use every time, the collect for the peace and the collect for aid, they are different from morning prayer, but they're in the same place as those other two collects for morning prayer. So it's all pretty much the same from there. Questions on evening prayer, comments on evening prayer before we look at something else? Pam?
I think that the question I have is really about the creeds. They give you a choice of doing the Nicene or the Apostles. Is there some, is that just your tradition, whoever the priest in charge is, or?
So classically speaking, the Apostles' Creed is the creed for the offices. It's the creed that our baptismal vows are based off of in the West. And so there's kind of this desire in the daily offices to keep that baptismal vow front and center, and then make the Nicene Creed kind of the special creed that we use for Holy Communion, because that's the creed of the whole church. In the East, they don't really use the Apostles' Creed or the Athanasian Creed. And of course, the American Church omitted the Athanasian Creed. But in the old 1662, there were 13 days when you would use the Athanasian Creed instead of the Apostles' Creed on a certain holy days, basically, in morning prayer. But really, the Apostles' Creed is the one that ought to be used, but the rubrics do permit the Nicene Creed. I'm pretty sure the reason why that was done was, again, because Holy Communion wasn't being celebrated as often, and neither was kind of a service of anti-communion, that only service of the word from communion. We'll talk about that in the future. So I think that was kind of a desire of the framers of the prayer book, to give the option for parishes that aren't doing communion very often, to still bring in that Nicene Creed, that kind of creed with a capital C, that creed of the whole church.
Thank you.
And so, you do have that option in morning prayer as well. My recommendation is go with, just like I would say, choose those gospel canticles rather than the Psalms for your canticles. I would recommend using the Apostles' Creed, because that really puts us in that historic pattern. And to me, that's very important, being in that historic pattern.
I have a question, Father Isaac, about, at in the evening and morning prayers at the end, there's a prayer of Saint Chrysostom.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why was St. Chrysostom chosen?
Okay, so yeah, John Chrysostom was the best preacher of his age, and he's really kind of the favorite um, for his writings, especially his homiletical writings. Uh, and at the time of the Reformation, when they were rediscovering Greek and kind of rediscovering some of those Eastern fathers, a lot of the Greek fathers had fallen out of use in the Latin West during the Middle Ages. It's not that nobody knew about them, it's just that because they didn't really know Greek, they weren't really going to them very often. Like they knew of them, but they didn't really know them. And during the Reformation, period of the Reformation, the humanists, again, they rediscovered, the people were relearning Greek, they were learning Hebrew for the first time. We were expanding beyond Latin. And so the reformers just loved John Chrysostom, especially his homiletical writings. And so Thomas Cranmer put this prayer from St. John Chrysostom into that first Book of Common Prayer. Mostly, I think, just because he was a favorite of Thomas Cranmer. And it's just a really good prayer on top of that. I mean, it really sums up, the spirit of prayer that from our Lord's own teachings, the wherever two or three are gathered in my name. That's very much kind of the spirit of the prayer of St. John Chrysostom. So it made a really good penultimate prayer for morning and evening prayer.
He was highly thought of then by the reformers.
Yeah, they absolutely loved him, and it was because they really put such a high priority on preaching, and so did he. I mean, that name Chrysostom means golden mouthed, and it was his nickname because he was such a good preacher. And really, him and Augustine are the guys who we have the most scripture commentary on, not because they were writing commentaries, but because they were preaching systematically through books of the Bible, and their students preserved their writings. They were basically writing them down in shorthand as they were preaching them. And then so we just have tons of homilies from for just about all the scripture from both Augustine and Chrysostom, and those two were, of course, the favorites of the reformers for that reason. Anything else on evening prayer? All right, well, let's flip over to family prayer. And the reason why I wanted to look at family prayer next is because this was really designed for the context of at-home devotions. And it's a really good kind of on-ramp for the full service in your private devotion. So you can find, you can find family prayer beginning on page 587. A little bit of history for this. We see the first part of family prayer. So basically, the full morning prayer and evening prayer from family prayer. So that's our first 4 or 5 pages. Those became part of the American prayer book tradition from the get-go, and nobody else had put family prayers for use in families, kind of private prayers for families in their edition of the prayer book, and nobody did so until Canada did in 1922. So we really have 400 years, 350 years or so of where the American church was the only one that had thought to put prayers specifically for family devotions into the prayer book. But that said, these prayers were composed by Bishop Edmund Gibson in 1705, and he was the Bishop of London during basically the end of his time. And he lived a long time, so basically the last 50 or so years of his life, he was the Bishop of London. And as such, he during the time of when the American colonies were under the Church of England, rather before the American church was independent, he was the bishop over the American church, because as the Bishop of London, he basically had jurisdiction over the overseas mission churches. And he had composed these prayers or really assembled them based on some prayers from the Archbishop of Canterbury back at the end of the 17th century, so the late 1600s. And yeah, Gibson was just a really godly man. He was offered the Archbishopric of Canterbury a couple of times, and he turned him down because he thought it would distract him from his pastoral work. And he was often preaching against the vices of his day. He had a soft spot for the Wesley brothers, even though he didn't share their what he called enthusiasm, kind of the that inner voice reliance that was in Methodism. But their evangelism, their preaching, he thought it was just a great idea, and he was friends with them. And he had a big concern for evangelizing the slaves in the colonies, and he was, my understanding is, he was advocating for their abolition, and of course that didn't happen. But so he was just a really godly man, and so this first morning and evening prayer were really his prayers that he composed, and they were widely distributed throughout the Anglican world. So even though they weren't in the prayer book until the American prayer book put them in there, they were widely used. They're just absolutely gorgeous 17th century prose. If you read in, like, say, Jane Austen books, how they met for family prayer, chances are these were the prayers they were using. Because I mean, these were just all over the place. Incidentally, Jane Austen did compose some of her own family prayers that then got distributed too. But you know, when those big houses, those big families were using family devotions, these were probably the ones they were using. Now, in the 1928 prayer book, they introduced the shorter form, which begins on page 592, as well as all these other supplementary additional prayers that follow it. So the rest of the family prayer section. The shorter form, and that's what I'm going to probably talk about more today, is based more on the daily offices than Bishop Gibson's prayers that are kind of the longer form of morning and evening family prayer are. I really like the shorter form because of that, and we'll talk about that in just a second before we kind of get into detail on that. Those additional prayers, I mentioned this last week or the week before, they really were, some of them are more designed for kind of family life, but most of them are almost supplements to the prayer and thanksgiving section. And as I said before, my understanding is the reason why they were here rather than there is that the Episcopal Church wanted to have freedom to edit them without having to have 3 general conventions. And they end up getting used practically in the same way as those other prayers do. And we'll talk about those other prayers in the future. But for right now, let's look at those shorter versions of morning and evening prayer. For those of you with children or grandchildren, especially very young children and grandchildren, these are just excellent for getting the kids to build up that discipline of family prayer. They're short enough that you can do this at bedtime or before school. And what I usually like to do with my girls, you know, for those who don't know, I mean, everybody here in the Zoom call do, but other folks watching, you know, my eldest is 5, my youngest is just north of 1.5. I'll usually add to this shorter form 1 or 2 of the canticles and the Apostles' Creed. I'll usually sing the whole thing. I'll chant the whole thing with them. My 5-year-old knows it pretty well. She can chant along with me. My 1-year-old, she just kind of falls asleep on Daddy's shoulder when I do it, and which is good. I mean, that's part of what it's about. You know, getting it in her. So I find that very, just as a practical way of kind of an on-ramp, taking these shorter forms of morning evening prayer and fleshing them out with the stuff from the offices is a really good way of building up the offices for those who find it a little overwhelming, or especially when you're dealing with kids. Incidentally, the family prayer section of the 2019 ACNA book is really based on that idea of let's take the offices, cut them down to their essentials, and so that they can be an on-ramp for the full service, which is really how I'm using this shorter form with my kids. So that's a really good practical way of building to the full service. And it's not that the longer, Bishop Gibson's prayers aren't good. I mean, they're very helpful, but in terms of building, if the goal is to do morning and evening prayer from the offices at home in your devotions, they're not going to really help you very much, just because they do really depart from, other than using the Lord's Prayer. These are all prayers that you don't find in the offices. They're prayers that Bishop Gibson or the previous Archbishop of Canterbury had composed for use in families. So that's my take on the family prayer section. As far as those additional prayers and the stuff you'll find in the prayer and thanksgiving section, those are really good occasional prayers that you might want to pepper in at different times. Like if you get asked to, say George gets asked to, in one of his public speaking things, I know you do that from time to time, George, to give a little invocation, grabbing something from one of those sections that's kind of appropriate to the occasion is I find that works really well. I like to do that for vestry and things like that. You'll find prayers for various problems that can happen in society, prayer for rain and prayer for God to hold back the rains when there's too much, for example, prayers for the government when it's sitting in session, various prayers for the church. So yeah, that prayer and thanksgiving section that follows evening prayer, supplemented by those family prayers, get to know those because they're going to be helpful. My understanding is that our intercessory prayer group, when they meet on Friday, they often use those, kind of go through a bunch of those prayers as springboards for extemporaneous prayer. So they'll pray the prayer books prayer from the prayer and thanksgiving from the family prayer section, and then they'll pray for specific needs on top of that. And I do find that, again, for when we're dealing with kind of really getting into intercession, spending a good amount of time, these really do help with that as well. And you can always put them either after the third collect or before the general Thanksgiving or the general intercession in morning or evening prayer as well. So they work well as a standalone. They work well in conjunction with the other services. If I was going to use them at communion, I would do it right before the blessing. We've done that before too, or before the homily or something like that. So yeah, very, very flexible, really good to use in your daily lives. There's a prayer for times of pestilence for our COVID-19 times too. So all these things work really well. Any thoughts, questions on, comments on family prayer at this point either?
I thought that's interesting to do those short family prayers as an introduction for the kids for the actual service later on. That's pretty practical, very practical.
Yeah, and I think that's probably part of why they introduced that shorter form in the 28 was, once we get to the 20th century, the pace of life is just increasing. It's even more so now. But, we want to have kind of A, we want that on-ramp to the full service, and B, we want to have no excuse to just ignore prayer. And these shorter ones, if you can't do nothing else, at least we can do these short prayers. Okay, let's look at the litany, the Great Litany, before we call it a night. And you can find that on page 56, I believe. I'm sorry, page 54. Page 54, the Great Litany. So the litany, or general supplication, a lot of folks today kind of associate this with Lent, specifically Ash Wednesday, or with that first Sunday in in Advent, kind of kicking off our penitential seasons. And yeah, I mean, they do work well for that, especially that Ash Wednesday use. It really is ideal. If you're not going to do the litany any other time, doing the litany on Ash Wednesday in conjunction with the penitential office is really good. Our parish tradition, for those of y'all that haven't been around for those, is we do use the litany and the penitential office on Ash Wednesday. And then the first Sunday of Advent and the first Sunday of Lent, we will usually chant the litany as the processional hymn to kick off those seasons. But the litany really is a good prayer to supplement morning and evening prayer at other times as well. It was the first of the Latin prayers to be translated into English. This was actually translated during the time of Henry VIII. And the occasion was, if memory serves, they were in the middle of potential war, and Henry wanted his people to be praying for the country and for them. And so, yeah, Thomas Cranmer translated it into English, and it was done in procession in the streets. You know, they were singing the Great Litany in English. So that kind of thing that we do, it makes a really good processional sort of thing, because it really does have a movement. That word litany refers to the call and response aspect of it. And it's, yeah, so this being the Great Litany is, you know, the shorter litany would be those versicles from morning and evening prayer, especially evening prayer. You'll notice that the rubric at the top of 54 says to be used after the third collect at morning or evening prayer, or before the Holy Communion, or separately. So again, we have a lot of flexibility. In the 1662, the rubric was Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. The litany was to be appended to morning prayer after that third collect, and everywhere. That's what you did on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Wednesdays and Fridays being the traditional fast days or abstinence days in the Western Church, or really in the church period. And then Sunday being kind of as a preparation for Holy Communion. Because the ideal was we would have morning prayer, litany, and communion on Sundays, or if not full communion, at least anti-communion. So I do recommend working in the litany, especially during those penitential seasons. And I recommend working it in at least once a week if you can. It's a good discipline. On Fridays, sometimes I'll kind of, during my lunch break, I'll do the litany as my noontime prayer. So, and what the litany ends up doing, just again, we're not going to hit all the details on it, unless y'all, after you look at it, you have some questions on it. But it really takes us through asking for God's provision and God's mercy on every aspect of life. I mean, we start with our issues of sin, the issues of spiritual warfare, those things that will keep us from God. We go into praying for the church, praying for the civil government, things like that, praying for missions, praying for receptiveness of God's word, praying for protection from war and danger and all that sort of thing. So it's a really comprehensive prayer. And again, during this time of COVID pestilence, it's particularly helpful. So that's the litany. You know, the American Prayer Book doesn't have that requirement, that rubrical requirement for doing it on Wednesdays and Fridays and Sundays, but it's a good thing to add in from time to time, and probably Fridays are the most recommended way. I think on Cradle of Prayer, they do tend to throw in the litany on Fridays oftentimes. Anything on those, on the Great Litany? Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and call it a day. I would like to ask you all to look through, pray through morning prayer, or more, keep going with morning prayer, mix in an evening prayer, kind of see how that goes. Look through the family prayer, and I would recommend going through the litany at least once. If nothing else, read through them. If you have any questions, any comments for next week, we'll start off that way before we get into new material. But it's good stuff.
Before you go, I do have a question.
All right, Chris.
If you can see me, can hear me. I have a quick question. Is it, when it comes to morning prayer, kind of being new to this, is it something you want to do before you do anything during the day? Is that the better way of doing it? Like before you, let's say I'm a gardener, so I'm required almost to keep my plants alive to water them like super early in the morning. So should I do morning prayer before I go out and do that, or should I do it, or should it be before you do anything in the day? Is that how it's supposed to be done? I'm just kind of trying to figure out what's the best time, or should it be before breakfast or something like that?
So when it comes to your private devotions, the best answer is going to be what works best to have you do it is going to be best.
Okay.
For me, what that usually means, if I'm doing it privately, I've got to do it very first thing. Otherwise, I'm probably not going to get it done. If I'm going to, or if I'm going to try to make it and do it at the church, it's going to be that first thing before I open up my email, before I answer a phone call. I got to get in there and do it. Otherwise, I know I'm going to get too busy. Traditionally, it's been kind of before 10 a.m. is kind of ideal, but again, there's no rubrics on that. And when you're doing it in your private devotions, what's going to work is best. I actually find when I'm dealing with family prayer for the kids, evening prayer is so much easier than morning prayer, because right away it's so easy to just kind of hit the ground running. And maybe ideally we do it together at breakfast. That's how my mom always did our family devotions, was at breakfast. But okay, at this age, everybody's making their own thing, or I'm making everybody's thing, and nobody's actually sitting down together for breakfast. And so that's why I find morning prayer with the kids is a lot more difficult to do regularly than evening prayer, even in that short family prayer context. But that, again, that's kind of the way it works in my family. And so your mileage may vary. And kind of anticipating a follow-up on evening prayer, kind of after 3 p.m. is the tradition for evening prayer. So, and I think the way it often went in kind of rural parish areas was that they would do, if they were going to do all the services on Sunday, they would do a very, very early morning Holy Communion, like 7 o'clock in the morning, kind of for the faithful. Then they would do mid-morning morning prayer and litany, and then do a very kind of a 3 p.m., 4 p.m. evening prayer, because everybody's still kind of more or less gathered. I mean, you take a couple hours break to go grab lunch or whatever, and then everybody comes back to church. So that's kind of the way it used to go. And again, I find, for me, if I'm going to do it at the church evening prayer, almost always it's got to be between 3 and 4, because once it gets to be 4 o'clock, there's things start to pile on. Everybody's trying to get you before you go home at the day, and so that's what works best for me on that. Oh, and incidentally, that does remind me also regarding the family prayer. Part of the reason why it was included in the American Prayer Book from the get-go, rather than just kind of being a separate private devotion, was the American church realized early on, we're going to have a lot of folks that are just too far away from a church, rural folks, farming folks, and having something they can do at home as a family is really helpful. So that's why it was kind of made official from the get-go for us. All right, anything else on anything that we've done or said so far? Pam.
I know when you were talking about the litany, at times we say the Great Litany, sometimes we just say litany. Is there any difference?
The litany is the Great Litany. It's the same thing. I think in the traditional, more Latin name would be Great Litany. Ours doesn't actually say great, I noticed. I think other editions of the prayer book too. But yeah, it's the Great Litany. It's the litany, but we do have shorter litanies. We've also got the litany for ordinations that we'll look at later. You know, a tradition not post-Reformation Anglicans, but certainly a medieval tradition, was the Litany of the Saints, you know, said before communion, at the beginning of communion. The way we do the Ten Commandments is a litany as well, almost like it kind of took the place of the Litany of the Saints in the Mass. So, but yeah, when we talk about the litany or the Great Litany, it's the same thing. Matt?
Oh, I just kind of came up with a question because I kind of Googled Great Litany, you know, in context of like, you know, I know we always talk about the Latin church, but I looked up the Greek church, and they do it before every sacrament. Is that
Okay.
so? Is that common with us too, with doing it before every sacrament, or is it?
Once upon a time, it was common to do it before, always on Sunday. So you would have it as part of the Holy Communion whenever you're going to have it. And I think that you saw that the rubric was after the third collect and morning reading prayer, or before Holy Communion, or at any other time. And so I do think that if memory serves, that among congregations back in the day that would have that really early morning communion, they would probably start it with the Great Litany.
Right.
Before baptism, probably not, except for the fact that baptisms are usually done in the context of one of the offices or communion. So traditionally, it would have been probably part of it, even if it wasn't intentionally part of the baptismal service. You know, same thing, you know, weddings were usually done as part of morning or evening prayer. You know, ordinations have their own litany. So yeah, I mean, I think in practical terms, it ended up being that way, but I don't think it was kind of intentionally thought of that way. And probably one of the reasons why it was done that way was probably our reformers were probably taking some cues from the Greek church. They looked at a lot of what was going on in the Greek church at the time, specifically the Greeks. Not Eastern Orthodoxy in general, but specifically the Greeks, because part of that revival of learning, that relearning of Greek, and they were looking at kind of the Greek ecclesiology, the more conciliar method of doing things. So with all of that said, they probably were taking some cues from the Greek church that way.
Yeah, because my thing with it is that I've kind of noticed, you know, we have a lot of similarities with the Greek church, and if you kind of read the history of, you know, the Reformation and stuff, you see a lot of kind of influence from the Greek church. And, you know, I think Luther, he actually, one of his guys had a bishop come over, or not a bishop, but someone came over and, you know, was teaching him all the stuff with the Greek church. But during the Reformation, they just didn't get enough influence from one another. So I find it kind of interesting that Anglicanism, you know, out of, you know, the mess that happened during the Reformation, actually really held to kind of those traditional values compared to what all this other mess that happened with all the other churches. So.
And we had a lot of cross between both us and the Lutherans have with various forms of the Eastern Church over the years. You know, Prince Philip, who is the Queen's consort, the Queen's husband, he was baptized Greek Orthodox. You know, his family came from Greece, and so yeah, he was Greek Orthodox, and he converted to Anglicanism kind of because you got to if you're going to be the queen's consort.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, what's her name? That last Romanov queen. Was it the last one? One of the major Romanov queens was Lutheran. She was from Germany, and in the 19th century, I'm not quite sure if in the 18th and 17th this was the case, but I do know that in the 19th century, most Orthodox bishops, if you were in an area that didn't have an Orthodox church, they would give you permission to go to the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Instead, they usually preferred that over the Roman Catholic Church because they saw there was a lot of similarities. And then we had famously some talks between Bishop Grafton and Saint Tikhon, now Saint Tikhon of the Russian Church, towards potential intercommunion. Unfortunately, that kind of died on the 20th century innovations on holy orders on our part, on the Episcopal Church's part. But yeah, there's been a lot of crossover, and I do know that there was talk at the time of the Reformation, hopes of kind of a reunion of East and West through that, and that the Eastern Church was looking at the Reformation. I think the big thing that kind of torpedoed that was one of the Archbishop, the Patriarch of Constantinople, a guy named Cyril Lucanus. He apparently, the stories are a little fuzzy on this, but it seems that he had really kind of fallen in love with Calvinism, and he tried to reconcile Calvinism with Eastern theology, and the rest of the bishops said, we're not doing that. And he ended up getting murdered while he was in prison. And so it's a weird situation. Like theologically, Cyril Lucanus is kind of looked at as a pariah, and really he's, Calvinism is considered a heresy in their eyes, in the eyes of the East, largely because of the problems with Cyril Lucanus. But at the same time, he's a hieromartyr. He's a martyr priest because he was murdered while in jail. But I think a lot of people kind of the historical speculation is he may have been murdered by folks that were kind of zealous for the Eastern Orthodox position, the kind of more traditional theology. So it's a weird situation.
Yeah, I'm not too fond of Calvin. I mean, he's got some strong points on some things. I think he really misunderstood predestination in the context of church history. And, what I've seen from, more modern Orthodox scholars is really what happened is the theology of the West really came from, I'm forgetting his name.
Anselm.
Yeah, Anselm. And so it's, you get this, this kind of overly legalistic and Calvin was a lawyer, so his worldview was very, legalistic. And so that's what kind of birthed Calvin out of, which is not what my understanding is with reading church history is, a lot of those issues that he created was he tried to make something that's, I think, a little bit more organic into something like a written law. So
yeah,
but
yeah, I've read most of the Institutes. There were a couple times I wanted to throw it across the room.
Yeah.
Other times, I was kind of nodding my head, giving him thumbs up and amens. Yeah, I definitely think that one of the big tragedies of the Reformation was the way that the Reformed and Lutheran strains kind of calcified on things that they probably should have left as mysteries, and then ended up, part of that was Calvin versus Luther, Luther versus Zwingli, and then of course those things end up being a barrier with reunion of the East. And it's not that some of those issues are unimportant. I tend to be unashamedly Augustinian, and I have high regard for Anselm And I think a lot of the Eastern critique is kind of misses the point, in my opinion. But yeah, some of those things I think could have been agree to disagree, but by the 16th century, it was a very polemical time, and we're still kind of the heirs of some of that. I think important matters. Theology matters, but some theology matters more than other theology. And I think some of those areas where the lines in the sand were put, I'm not so sure they should have been put there.
Yeah. Well, the thing is I've seen, like, especially on the internet, people get pretty vile about the differences in theology, and it's like, at a certain point, whenever you start being vile and like, it's like, well, now you're damaging your character over something that is an intellectual discussion. It needs to be talked about, but like, there are better ways of, reconciling, things than getting in a big old fight about it. So
yeah, nobody was ever argued into the kingdom. I mean, and that doesn't mean that apologetics is unimportant. Apologetics is very important, but nobody was ever arguing to the kingdom. The Reformed kind of have and I have a lot of friends that are Reformed. Some of my favorite preachers are Reformed Calvinists. The bishops, our bishop is, he self-identifies as Reformed Calvinist, but the Reformed kind of have a thing they call the cage stage Calvinists, where you're kind of, someone that's new to those doctrines and just wants to fight about it all the time. And they call it a cage stage because they say, okay, you need to be locked in a cage till you're out of this. And I think most everybody has, there's cage stages for all the traditions. I've certainly seen, on the other hand, folks that, used to be evangelicals that convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, they can, stereotypically they can be so, they get very cage stage well, and they're just as wanting to pick a fight as the cage stage Calvinist. And and we have some of those too. So
yeah, Anglicans are, because I guess, I don't know, Anglicanism, it seems like, is like they're a little bit nicer. It's like even the converts, it's like, well, yeah, we kind of know what our problems are. So I haven't seen very many converts to Anglicanism being, super vile, but there's not a lot of them anymore. So kind of
where we get ours is where you have the hardcore Anglo-Catholics that want to basically be, Romanism without a pope, and the really hardcore, we ought to look like things did in the 16th century Anglicans, who are on the exact opposite extreme on the Reformed end. They like to fight amongst themselves, but they're less apt to fight folks from outside of our camp. It's very much an intra-Anglican, and those get ugly, and that's where our cage stage people happen, are on those two extremes. Well, I think I'm going to stop the recording. We can continue this discussion before we alienate everybody. But yeah, this can kind of be more of an offline, and I will catch you all later on. But let's go ahead and stop the recording.